So vulnerability management is the last topic of this domain. So the process of identifying, classifying, prioritizing, remediating, and mitigating vulnerabilities in systems and software is called vulnerability management. It is a fundamental requirement of computer security and network security. So in order to have a mature security posture, your organization must implement a vulnerability management program. So let's see the process of vulnerability management. So the first step in the vulnerability management process is asset discovery. So before you can protect anything, you first need to discover your network, your resources, where they are located, what are its importance, and so on. So the first step in that process is asset discovery. You first need to discover your assets before protecting them. Now this includes discovering IP addresses, network topology, servers, mobile devices, and databases. So once we are familiar with our assets, the next step is to scan them. So in this step, we do port and vulnerability scans in order to identify open ports and any vulnerable services which are running. So for example, after a vulnerability scan, you may realize or discover that one of your servers has port 23 open and it is running a telnet service which is insecure. So the next step is vulnerability assessment. Whenever you do a vulnerability scan, practically what you're going to receive are maybe hundreds and thousands of vulnerabilities. Not all of those are serious and not all of those are pertinent or applicable to your particular situation. Moreover, not all the assets are equal in importance. Some of the assets contain highly sensitive information, or the asset itself may be very important. So basically you need to prioritize your assets, you need to prioritize your data. So for example, a database hosting confidential client information or company secrets is obviously more important compared to a server which is hosting just a static website. Another important point to realize is that not all of the vulnerabilities are exploitable. You sometimes can have a vulnerability, but it is not exploitable. So basically we need to also factor in the fact that sometimes some of the vulnerabilities are not exploitable, whereas some vulnerabilities which may appear not so high in severity, but they are easily exploitable. So there are a multitude of factors which you need to take into consideration, but perhaps the most important factor is the eventual business impact a vulnerability will have. So that will determine how much resources and time and how much priority you would assign to a vulnerability. So the last step is vulnerability mitigation. Now, based on the vulnerability assessment, you would have a list of vulnerabilities, let's say top X vulnerabilities that you need to definitely address. Now, vulnerability mitigation involves several different steps and eventually it depends on the types of vulnerability discovered and the assets which host those vulnerabilities. But generally speaking, we harden the security posture through some standard techniques. So for example, one popular technique is to disable unused services on your servers, or in fact any system of your network. So the key point is that if you don't need a service, it should not be working, it should not be running, because that can eventually provide an attack vector to attackers and they can penetrate your system through that. So the best and the safest approach is to close down any unused ports as well as close down any unused services. Another important fact is to patch vulnerabilities. So most of the vulnerabilities are well known and they have patches available. So basically you apply those patches and you ensure that the vulnerability has been addressed. Or if the patch is not available, because sometimes we have vulnerabilities which are called zero-day exploits, which basically means that the vulnerability is so new that there isn't an existing patch for that. In that case, you need to find workarounds. So this is the complete cycle. But please keep in mind, this is an ongoing process. So basically after vulnerability mitigation, so once again, you'll start with asset discovery. So this is a periodic process and you need to keep track of which type of assets are newly added to your network or to your system. And then you do another vulnerability scan, vulnerability assessment, and mitigation. So this is an ongoing process. It's kind of a cycle. So we're going to explore each of these steps individually. We'll start with asset discovery. So we first need to consider what are the different types of assets hosted by our organization. This may include software, mobile devices, servers, databases, and so on. Another important factor is what are the location of those assets. For example, we have key locations such as business offices, network infrastructure sites, backup sites. Another important factor is the software stack used. So basically, you need to be aware of what are the operating systems, database systems, and web applications hosted by your organization. Because if you're familiar with these things, then you would be in a good position to quickly identify vulnerabilities, especially those that become public knowledge. The final factor is criticality. So you need to identify what are the key assets that you must prioritize. Usually these are web applications and databases, but this really depends on the context. So for some organizations, they may have a priority of protecting their data, whereas for others, it may be their web application because they're servicing a large number of clients. So next is vulnerability scanning. Now, in some ways, vulnerability scanning can be compared to penetration testing. However, there are some key differences. So for example, penetration testing is usually more vigorous and more invasive. Now, vulnerability scanning can be considered as a scaled down version of penetration testing. It is obviously less vigorous and less invasive. And another key difference is that penetration testing is often done from outside. So basically, you sometimes hire third parties and they try to penetrate your network from the outside. In contrast, vulnerability scanning is a routine process which is done from inside your network. Now, vulnerability scanning involves some activities such as port scanning and vulnerability scanning, and we have tools available for both of those. Now, we have both open source products such as OpenVAS, Nexpose Community Edition, as well as commercial products for vulnerability scanning such as Qualys and CrowdStrike. Now, even though there are some differences between open source and commercial products in this arena, but generally speaking, all of these products, they rely on almost the same set of scripts and techniques. Now, obviously, commercial products such as Qualys, for example, they offer a better user experience. They offer better graphical user interface and they're more user friendly. But the open source products can also be used to get the job done. The next step is vulnerability assessment. Now, all vulnerability scanners, they basically have a pre-built database of vulnerabilities and they simply go and check those in your system. One big problem is the significant amount of noise that they generate. So even if you run a Qualys scan on a reasonably sized network, you will discover hundreds of thousands of vulnerabilities. Now, there's just so much noise that you definitely need to prioritize. You cannot obviously address 10,000 different vulnerabilities, which is not uncommon, by the way. Now, you need to prioritize based on the severity of the vulnerability and also the likelihood of occurrence. So, for example, if you have a vulnerability, but there's no way that anyone can exploit it due to some external factor, then you don't need to worry about it. On the other hand, if there is a vulnerability with medium severity, but there's a very good chance of exploitability, which means that it is very easy to exploit this vulnerability given your network infrastructure and security posture, then perhaps you need to pay more attention to that. Another important factor for prioritization is the possible impact on business. So obviously this is the bottom line. So any vulnerability which can impact your business operations need to be considered seriously. Now we have a system which is widely used in the cybersecurity community, which is called CVE, Common Vulnerabilities and Exposure. So basically, this contains definitions for publicly known vulnerabilities or exposures. The website is cve.mitre.org. Now, all of the known vulnerabilities are assigned a unique ID. So for instance, CVE 2017-11882 is a vulnerability which affects MS Office versions 2007 to 16, which basically allows hackers to execute code remotely once a malicious document is opened. So this is a remote code execution vulnerability. Now, CVE offers several interesting things. So first of all, it specifically identifies the products which are affected and the versions. And they also highlight the attack type, which can be expected. And they also assign the possible impact based on a severity rating score. Sometimes the possible solutions are also listed. This usually includes links to patches, for instance. So the first item is the description. This basically provides an overview of the vulnerability. The second is the severity rating, which is 7.8, basically a high severity rating, and it also includes links to possible solutions sometimes. So we use CVSS, the Common Vulnerability Scoring System, in order to score or rank vulnerabilities. This is a common framework for vulnerability severity rating, which basically assigns scores from 0 to 10. Now, low is considered 0.1 to 3.9, and then from 4 to 6.9, we have medium rating, and then high is considered 7 to 8.9, and finally we have the critical vulnerabilities in the range 9 to 10. So based on the assigned score, we can determine the severity of the vulnerability, and therefore appropriate resources can be assigned. The last step is vulnerability mitigation. So one of the most effective strategies to mitigate vulnerabilities is patching. So basically, whenever there is a well-known public vulnerability, so usually the company that developed the software, they release patches. So you should be vigilant. You should keep on checking if there are any known vulnerabilities, especially in the core components used by your web applications or your network, and you should keep them patched. An important point is you should always keep your systems up to date. Finally, you should always keep yourself updated. So you should be familiar with these resources, such as the CVE website and the National Vulnerability Database. And you should be vigilant about new vulnerabilities that become public and which might affect your network or your systems. So this is an ongoing process. You always discover new assets, then you do scanning, then you do prioritizing of the vulnerabilities based on the business impact, based on their severity rating, based on their exploitability potential, and then you mitigate them, and then you go back to the first step. So this is an ongoing process. This is a periodic process which every organization must ensure in order to have a decent security posture. So that includes our domain. I'll see you in the next domain.